Chapter 11, page 196. Stylistics, a theory or a practice. Para. Stylistics is a critical approach which uses the methods and findings of the science of linguistics in the analysis of literary texts. But by linguistics, here is meant the scientific study of language and its structures rather than the learning of individual languages. Stylistics developed in the 20th century, and its aim is to show how the technical linguistic features of a literary work, such as the grammatical structure of its sentences, contribute to its overall meanings and effects. Para. The account given below will put a good deal of emphasis on critical practice rather than critical theory, and we should ask at the outset whether stylistics is really a form of critical theory at all. The compilers of most currently available guides to literary theory assume that it is not, since they say nothing about it. But the grounds for this assumption are difficult to see. It is certainly an approach to literature which has yielded a large amount of practical work distinctly different in tone and method from what we are accustomed to. This body of practice is the product of very specific theories about literary language and how it works, and these theories are usually taught alongside the practice. Para. The grounds for excluding stylistics, therefore, probably lie in the nature of the theoretical outlook behind the discipline, for liberal humanism and stylistics have a good deal in common. Firstly, both have a strong empirical bias, that is, a bias towards detailed verbal analysis, page 197, of specific canonical literary texts rather than a commitment to establishing generalized theoretical positions. Secondly, both have kept aloof from the eclecticism which has led to so much cross-fertilization between Marxist, feminist, structuralist and post-structuralist approaches. And thirdly, both have generally refused to take on board the notion of the, quote, floating signifier, unquote. That is, the idea that the meanings established through language are innately fluid, indeterminate and shifting. Para. These similarities might lead us to expect the two to be natural allies, but in fact stylistics and liberal humanism fought with each other very bitterly in the 1960s, at least a decade before the outbreak of hostilities between liberal humanism and theory in general. However, stylistics also has its differences from other forms of critical theory, for it has resisted the relativism which permeates most other kinds of theoretical discourse. Everywhere outside stylistics indeterminacy rules, all critics scrupulously avoid totalizing claims and acknowledge that there can be no overviews, only viewpoints, each of which is partial. Stylistics, by contrast, remains positivist in outlook. That is, it maintains its faith in the accumulation of knowledge by empirical investigation of external phenomena carried out by disinterested inquirers. There are good reasons then for regarding stylistics as different, but none in my view for regarding it as untheoretical. Its advantage too for those who are just beginning theory is that it does offer a wide range of new practical methods for explicating literature, many of which can be enjoyable to practice, especially when working in class in groups. Para. Stylistics, it should be added, is not confined to the analysis of literature. It can be applied equally to expository prose, political speeches, advertisements, and so on. It thus assumes that the language of literature is not a special case. On the contrary, literary language can be analyzed just like any other kind to reveal precisely how effects are created. Hence, stylistics concedes no special mysterious qualities to literary language. It is not seen as sacred or revered. It is simply the data on which the method can be put to use. It is true, of course, that very few literary critics of any persuasion today would make semi-mystical claims that poetry is inspired or ineffable or operates beyond reason in a realm which analysis can never fully penetrate. Page 198. But, on the other hand, neither do many of them proclaim the contrary, that literary language never has any transcendental dimension which lifts it above the everyday. Section: A brief historical account from rhetoric to philology to linguistics to stylistics to new stylistics. Para. Stylistics is, in a sense, the modern version of the ancient discipline known as rhetoric, rhetoric, which taught its students how to structure an argument, how to make effective use of figures of speech, and generally how to pattern and vary a speech or a piece of writing so as to produce the maximum impact. Rhetoric in medieval times played an important part in training people for the church, the legal profession, and political or diplomatic life. But once divorced from this vocational purpose, it degenerated into a rather arid and mechanical study of the mere surface features of language, which involved, for instance, identifying and classifying figures of speech. The pedantic outlook of its practitioners, for instance, their love of impressive-sounding labels, is frequently satirized by Chaucer, Shakespeare, and others. Traces of this degenerate form of the discipline survived in school teaching until quite recently. Para. Throughout the 19th century, rhetoric in this medieval sense was gradually absorbed into linguistics. At this time, linguistics was usually known as philology, philology, and was almost entirely historical in emphasis. It involved studying the evolution of languages and the interconnections between them, and speculating about the origins of language itself. In the 20th century, there was a movement away from this historical emphasis and a new concentration on how language as a system is structured, looking at such aspects as the way meanings are established and maintained, and the options available and their consequences in structuring sentences. This is where a kind of born-again form of rhetoric emerged, shortly before the First World War, with a new interest in literary style and its effects, an interest seen also in the work of the Russian formalists, chapter 8, pages 155-156, in the 1920s, and in the work of the Russian linguist Roman Jakobson, leader of the Prague Linguistic Circle, chapter 8, page 156, who lived in America after the Second World War. A famous, quote, conference on style, unquote, was held at Indiana University in 1958, page 199, and the proceedings published in 1960 as Style in Language, edited by Thomas Sebeok, Sebeok, Technology Press of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and John Wiley and Sons, New York. The conference was notable, among other things, for Jacobson's, quote, closing statement, unquote, which seems to announce a takeover bid for literature on the part of linguistics. Indent opens. Poetics deals with problems of verbal structure, colon. Since linguistics is the global science of verbal structure, comma, poetics may be regarded as an integral part of linguistics. Parenthesis, poetics here means the study of literature in general, comma, not just poetry. Parenthesis closes, stop, indent closes. Para. The gist of the Sebeok collection of material is to claim that linguistics offers a more objective way of studying literature, and the book tends to set up, quote, a confrontation of camps, unquote, Roger Fowler's phrase, between literary and language studies. Fowler responded to what he saw as this unhelpful polarization by editing a collection called Essays on Style and Language, Linguistic and Critical Approaches to Literary Studies, 1966, which tried to mend the damage done by what Fowler regarded as, quote, an unnecessary schism between language, unquote, and literature, unquote. But the result, if anything, was to widen the gap. Fowler's collection was reviewed by Helen Wendler, Vendlar, in the journal Essays in Criticism, 1966, pages 457-463. She suggested that while linguistic study had great potential, at present linguists are simply undereducated in the reading of poetry and are taking on documents whose primary sense and value they are not equipped to absorb. Page 460. This stung Fowler into a riposte which inaugurated a much-cited debate between himself and F.W. Batson, Bateson, the journal's editor. See Essays in Criticism, 1967, pages 332-47 and 1968, pages 164-182. The outcome of this was again to solidify the language-literature polarization. Para. But the period up to the 1980s saw the development of what Helen Wendler had said was lacking in linguistics, namely a form of discourse analysis which would enable linguistics to comment on, analyze the structure of complete pieces of writing rather than just the isolated phrases and sentences to which it had previously been restricted. This meant that non-linguistics began to take some interest in the findings of linguistic essays, while at the same time linguists writing such material realized the need to consult and incorporate non-linguistic material. Page 200. Allegedly, this resulted during the 1980s in what came to be called the new stylistics, which had a limited degree of eclecticism in that it drew on the findings of other new kinds of criticism, feminist, structuralist, post-structuralist, and so on, and was less likely to claim that it alone studied literature in an objective way. Para. In fact, however, the superiority claims from both sides continued. Fowler, for instance, in his 1986 book, Linguistic Criticism, characterizes linguistic criticism as objective description of texts, page 4, while conventional criticism, by contrast, uses, quote, random descriptive jargon, unquote, page 3, and is merely, quote, amateur commentary, unquote, using only quasi-grammatical terms. Also, his 1980s writing repeated very similar arguments to those he had used in the 1960s against Batson. Thus, opponents, he says in 1986, speak as if linguistics were a single entity, whereas actually there are many different techniques in use within it, some appropriate for literary study and some not. This is exactly the same point as he had made in the 1960s. Quote, there is no one linguistics, ... Bland, undefined accounts of, quote, linguistics, unquote, lead nowhere, unquote. Essays in Criticism, 1967, page 325. Likewise, not all stylistics in the 1960s made uncompromisingly exclusive claims for the discipline, so the more liberal attitude said to be distinctive of the new stylistics is not something which appears only in the 1980s. Thus, Fowler again in the Batson dispute stressed that just being a linguist isn't a qualification for dealing adequately with poetry. On the contrary, quote, although literature is language and therefore open to ordinary formal linguistic investigation, it has, like other formally distinctive texts, essentially distinctive contexts which the linguist no less than the critic must study, unquote. Essays in Criticism, 1967, page 325, para. Hence, the grounds for setting up a sequence in which stylistics gives way to new stylistics are slender. Combative old stylistics attitude are common today and are explicit in much recent writings in the field. For instance, Nigel Fabb, F-A-B-B, and Alan Durant, D-U-R-A-N-T, describing the difference between stylistics and literary criticism in the mid-1980s, say that in the latter, critical comment is often made without any accompanying systematic or even explicit scrutiny of its own methods or assumptions. The Linguistics of Writing, Arguments Between Language and Literature, Manchester University Press, 1987, page 228. Thus, while it is true to say that stylistics today tends to be, page 201, more open than before to input from those working in other areas of intellectual inquiry, it would be exaggerating to imply the kind of clean break with the hard line past implied by the term, quote, new stylistics, unquote, stop. The current mood of cooperation is represented by the Interface series from Routledge. Series editor Ronald Carter, which aims to, quote, build bridges between the traditionally divided disciplines of language studies and literary studies, unquote, stop. It should be added that doubtless the old hardline attitudes against stylistics still exist too. But in recent years, structuralism and post-structuralism rather than stylistics have usually been seen as the major threat to traditional values in criticism, with the consequence that most liberal humanist polemical writing has been directed at these targets. Section, How does stylistics differ from standard close reading? Para. Stylistic analysis attempts to provide a commentary which is objective and scientific, based on concrete quantifiable data and applied in a systematic way. In contrast, as we have seen, conventional close reading is often seen by the stylistician to a greater or lesser extent as impressionistic, intuitive, and randomized. All the same, the differences between the two approaches might well seem superficial to a casual observer, so it is worth trying to specify them. The specific differences between conventional close reading and stylistics include the following. 1. Close reading emphasizes differences between literary language and that of the general speech community. It tends to isolate the literary text and see it as a purely aesthetic art object or verbal icon whose language operates according to rules of its own. Stylistics, by contrast, emphasizes connections between literary language and everyday language. This difference of view about literary language is actually a continuation of a very old dispute. For instance, the critical break between Wordsworth and Coleridge lay in the fact that Wordsworth believed that poetic language, when most effective, was at its plainest and most prose-like, that is, when it is as close as possible to the language actually used by men. In contrast, Coleridge believed that poetic language depended for its effect on the poet's heightening or intensifying it, 202, through patterning, compression, repetition, and so on, and thus making it more specialized and taking it further away from the patterns of everyday speech. 2. Stylistics uses specialized technical terms and concepts which derive from the science of linguistics, terms like transitivity, under lexicalization, collocation, collocation, and cohesion, cohesion, all of which are explained in the final section of this chapter. Terms like these are part of the technical vocabulary of a particular field of intellectual inquiry, and they do not have any currency outside this field. Unless you were talking shop with fellow students, you could not introduce these terms into casual conversation without explaining what they meant and, more importantly, what they were for. In contrast, close reading typically uses layperson's terms and concepts, which may have a slightly bookish air but are nevertheless part of ordinary everyday language. Terms, for instance, like verbal nuance, irony, ambiguity, paradox, and ambivalence. If you started to explain the meaning of these terms in the same casual conversation, you would probably seem rather patronizing, even though the use of these terms in criticism might be considered slightly specialized, and each of them has its own resonance and associations within the discipline. The point is, though, that these terms are clearly not technical in the way the under-lexicalization is. 3. Stylistics makes greater claims to scientific objectivity than does close reading, stressing that its methods and procedures can be learned and applied by all. Hence, its aim is partly the demystification of both literature and criticism. Thus, in relation to literature, it aims to show, as we saw above, the continuity between literary language and other forms of written communication. In the case of criticism, it aims to provide a set of procedures which are openly accessible to all, in contrast to the tendency within close reading to stress the need for the critic to develop tact and sensitivity towards the literary text and avoid spelling out a method or procedure to be followed. Hence, for instance, the notorious reluctance of F.R. Lewis to describe or set out in detail his critical methods. Likewise, readers often express the feeling that the language of literature achieves its effects in ways which may prove inherently inaccessible to analysis, page 203, so that at the core of literature is a kind of mysterious, impenetrable essence. If, as many believe, the sentiments expressed in a poem are uniquely embodied in the form of words chosen by the poet, then it must follow that there are strict limits to what can be added by critical inquiry. Section: The Ambitions of Stylistics. 1. Stylisticians try to provide hard data to support existing intuitions about a literary work. Stylistics is not always just about the interpreting of individual literary works, but when it is engaged in straight textual interpretation, it often tries to back up the, as they would see them, impressionistic hunches of common readers with hard linguistic data. Thus, we might, in reading a Hemingway short story, register an impression something like, Hemingway has a plain style which is very distinctive. Stylisticians would try to be much more specific. Their question might be, what do we mean exactly by plain, P-L-A-I-N? Well, perhaps we need no linguistic training to realize that Hemingway generally avoids descriptive words like adverbs and adjectives, where another writer might say something like, Smith ran purposefully through the heavy rain. Hemingway would omit the adverb purposefully and the adjective heavy. He would want these things to emerge implicitly, which would actually, in his view, given them greater impact. So the sentence would be simply, Smith ran through the rain. The stylistician might calculate Hemingway's usage in a given tell in a statement like 73% of the nouns and verbs used by Hemingway in ... are without adjectival or adverbial qualification. There might be a comparison with work by other writers generally perceived as having a less plain style, perhaps resulting in the claim that these writers have only 30% of nouns and verbs unqualified. Of course, the calculating would be applied to a section of the work only, perhaps to a tale by each of the writers concerned, which would be intuitively felt to be typical of each. The result is not to give us new information exactly about Hemingway, since every reader realizes very quickly that his sparse, plain style is one of his most distinctive qualities. But it will have told us a good deal about precisely how, in linguistics terms, the plainness is achieved and maintained. Page 204. 2. Stylisticians suggest new interpretations of literary works based on linguistic evidence. Stylistics brings a special expertise to bear on the linguistic features of a text, and therefore sees a dimension of the material which the ordinary reader would be unaware of. This dimension may well contain material which could alter our interpretation of the work. For instance, Colleen McCabe, capital M small ac, capital C small abe, McCabe, argues in an essay on stylistics that Falstaff in Shakespeare's history plays has an element of sexual ambiguity. He frequently refers, for example, to his large stomach and how it makes bravery very difficult, but the word he uses is not stomach but womb. My womb, my womb, my womb undoes me. At the time the play was written, says McCabe, the word womb was in a state of semantic transition. That is to say, its meaning was gradually changing from an older sense to a newer one. In its old sense, it was a general word for stomach and was used interchangeably of both men and women. But it was also then acquiring its more specialized modern meaning, where it is gender specific and designates a particular part of female anatomy. Since both senses of the word were possible while it was in the transition stage from one sense to the other, Falstaff's use of the word suggests a corresponding sexual ambivalence in himself. Only the reader in possession of this specialized knowledge about semantic change would realize this. Other readers would first be puzzled by the word, would then perhaps look it up in a glossary, and would finally conclude that the word is simply being used in an obsolete sense and hence had no bearing upon questions of characterization or interpretation. There are, I think, problems in accepting McCabe's account of this example. He assumes that words which are in process of semantic change have traces of both meanings present in every usage, but it seems more likely that in these cases a word can have either meaning, but not both. For example, the word disinterested today is in process of semantic change, but every given usage signifies either impartial or else not interested, and never a combination of these meanings. A more general problem is to decide the status of evidence which is below the threshold of perception of all readers except professional linguists, page 205. How, for instance, did such meanings get into the text? Deliberately planted by the author? Presumably not. And in what sense are they, quote, there, unquote, at all, if normally imperceptible except to a group of readers whose existence, except in the case of present-day texts, could not have been predicted? All the same, the general point is clear. Linguists use their specialized knowledge not just to support existing readings, but to establish new ones. 3. Stylisticians attempt to establish general points about how literary meanings are made. The point here is that, like all the other new approaches to literature, stylistics is interested not just in the individual literary work, but also in much more general questions about how literature works. For instance, linguists argue that a literary effect is created simultaneously in terms of both form and content. In Hardy's Tests of the D'Urbervilles, Tess's subjection to the social and physical superiority of Alec, A-L-E-C, is expressed both in terms of what is said and in terms of the grammatical structure of the seduction, or rep seen for his having power is reinforced subliminally by Alec, awesome attribute of him frequently being the subject of sentences, while Tess's lack of power is reinforced by her frequently being the grammatical object. Thus, sentences have patterns like he touched her, he subject, her object, semicolon. His fingers, subject, sank into her, object, and so on. This kind of argument, if accepted, has implications about how literary effects are created and how they operate. The implication is that the powerful literary effect is overdetermined, that is, it comes from different factors combining, so that content is subtly reinforced by grammatical structure, overall discourse structure, word choice, imagery, and so on. Literary meaning, this suggests, goes down to the very roots of language and is reflected at the level of grammar and sentence structure. Hence, no aspect of language is neutral. The patterns of grammar and syntax, morphemes, morphemes, and phonemes, phonemes, are all implicated in literary meaning. Again, I think there are difficulties with this as a general argument. For instance, it seems to make authors into intuitive genius figures who instinctively know the content of modern linguistics. All the same, the main point is clear, page 206. Stylistics tries to establish things which are generally true about the way literature works. Section Stop and Think. The linguistic terminology used in stylistics may seem daunting if you have never been taught any formal grammar, but it is probably unwise to try to learn formal grammar as a prelude to sampling stylistics. A better way is to make use of a few basic reference tools and have these by you for consultation as you read some of the items listed at the end of this section. I would suggest you use a dictionary of stylistics, Katie, Wells, Wales, Longman 1989, and a good up-to-date compendium of English grammar. I have found the kind intended for advanced learners of English more useful than others. A good example is Michael Swann's SWANN''S Practical English Usage, Oxford University Press, 1980. Para. A problem to focus on as you begin your involvement with this topic is the one highlighted by Stanley Fish in his essay, quote, "What is stylistics and why are they saying such terrible things about it?" unquote. Fish says that there is always a gap between the linguistic features identified in the text and the interpretation of them offered by the stylistician. We might call this problem the hermeneutic, hermeneutic, hermeneutic gap, quote. Hermeneutic, unquote, means concerned with the act of interpretation. Para. For instance, it may be said that an utterance uses a large number of passive verbs, those patterned, quote, "I have been informed that, unquote. This is the linguistic feature. These passives, we may then be told, indicate a degree of evasiveness in the text. This is the interpretation. Para. The difficulty is knowing how we can be sure that there is a link between the use of the passive and evasiveness. Can we be sure that the user of the passive is usually being evasive in some way, for instance, trying to conceal the identity of the informant and, so to speak, to conceal that concealment? Was I being evasive when I used passives in the previous paragraph? If the passive is only sometimes evasive, what are the circumstances which make it so? Page 207, para. In your reading of the following examples then, and of some of the items listed at the end of the section, try to identify the moment when the critic passes from describing linguistic data to interpreting it, the moment when the hermeneutic gap opens up, and consider how convincingly or otherwise it is bridged. What stylistic critics do, 1. They describe technical aspects of the language of a text, such as grammatical structures, and then use this data in interpretation. 2. The purpose of doing this is sometimes simply to provide objective linguistic data to support existing readings or intuitions about a literary work. 3. At other times, the purpose is to establish a new reading which may be based only or mainly on this linguistic data and may challenge or counter existing readings. 4. These technical accounts of how meanings are made in literature are part of an overall project which involves showing that literature has no ineffable mystical core which is beyond analysis. Rather, it is part of a common universe of discourse and uses the same techniques and resources as other kinds of language use. 5. To this end, stylistics does not confine itself to the analysis of literature and often juxtaposes literary and other kinds of discourse. For instance, comparing the linguistic devices used in poetry with those of advertising. 6. Stylistics moves beyond sentence grammar to text grammar, considering how the text works as a whole to achieve or not its purposes. For instance, to amuse, to create suspense, or to persuade, and examining the linguistic features which contribute to these ends. Section Stylistics Examples, para. Rather than considering a single example in detail, I'll refer more briefly to 3, each of which uses some technical aspect of language in critical interpretation, page 208. The first makes use of the linguistic terms transitivity and under-lexicalization. What do these mean? The former refers to the different sentence patterns in which verbs can occur. Traditionally, a verb is said to be transitive when the action it designates has a stated goal or recipient or object. Thus, in the sentence, she shut the door, the action of shutting is received or suffered by the door. Hence, the verb shut is said to be transitive, which roughly means passing through, in the sense that the action passes through to the door. Door is said to be the object of this verb in the sentence just cited. By contrast, in the sentence, she vanished, the verb is said to be intransitive, since the action does not pass through to any stated object. It just happens and is, so to speak, self-sufficient. These 2 examples then represent different transitivity patterns, and while the grammatical categories transitive and intransitive are derived from traditional grammar as originally devised to describe the structures of the Latin language, the abstract notion of transitivity, designating the range of patterns possible for verbs, derives from the work of the linguist M.A.K. Halliday, Halliday, in the 1960s and 1970s. Halliday made use of the concept in analyzing fiction, and Roger Fowler follows him in this. Quote, under lexicalization, finally, is a term invented by Fowler, : It refers to cases where there is a lack of an adequate set of words to express specific concepts, unquote, K. Wells. Thus, we might not know the word for a particular implement and instead call it a thingy, Thingy, within quote, or a wotsit, Wotsit, within quote. Or we might forget the word for a particular object, the word handle, say, and use a vague descriptive substitute instead, such as the holding thing. These would be examples of slightly different types of under-lexicalization. Para. Let's now look at how a critic uses these terms in discussing the opening of William Faulkner's Faulkner novel The Sound and the Fury. In the essay by Roger Fowler from the collection Essays on Style and Language, 1966, already referred to. The opening is narrated from the point of view of Benjy, Benjy, who is a 33-year-old man with the mind of a young child. Benjy is watching a game of golf, indent. Through the fence, between the curling flower spaces, I could see them hitting stop. They were coming towards where the flag was, and I went along the fence stop. Luster, Luster, was hunting in the grass by the flower tree, page 209. They took the flag out, and they were hitting stop. Then they put the flag back and they went to the table, and he hit and the other hit. Indent closes. Para. Fowler writes, indent. There is a consistent oddity in transitivity. Colon. There are almost no transitive verbs with objects. A preponderance of intransitives, parenthesis, within quote coming, quote went, hunting, etc., parenthesis closes, and one transitive, hit, hit, used repeatedly without an object, ungrammatically. Indent closes para. This constitutes the linguistic data. Fowler now takes the step from description to interpretation. This, quote, oddity to transitivity, unquote, such as using the word heat without saying what was heat, implies that Benji has little sense of actions and their effects on objects. This is, I think, a little overspecific, but clearly we notice as we read that there is something strange about Benji's language, and we register this as indicating that there is something strange about his mind. This something strange about the language concerns the transitivity pattern. Implicitly, Fowler's point is that the author's choosing this linguistic feature to disturb is significant, for of course a disturbed state of mind could, in theory, be conveyed by disrupting any language feature at all. Secondly, Benji's under-lexicalization is seen in the way he often uses descriptive circumlocutions rather than the right words for things. Thus, he never uses the word golf or for what he is watching, and he calls a bush a flower tree. This again is the data. Interpreting it involves the suggestion that doing this indicates the character's inability to perceive the world in socially acceptable ways as most other people do. Thus, the stylistician explains the extent of the character's isolation by a stylistic analysis of aspects of the language associated with him. Para. Another example of the kind of linguistic data used by stylisticians is seen in Ronald Carter's analysis of W. H. Auden's poem Capital in Carter and Barton, edited Literary Text and Language Study. Edward Arnold, 1982. Carter makes use of the notion of collocation, a term which refers to the habitual or expected co-occurrence of words. Wells. This is a reference to the fact that words frequently occur in groupings which have a degree of predictability even when they fall short of being set phrases which invariably have the same pattern. This aspect of language used to be exploited in the British TV game show Blankety Blank. To demonstrate what I mean, let me ask you, page 2210, to complete each of the following phrases with a single word, a different word in each case, and in each case putting in the word which first occurs to you. A box of ... a black ... an uninvited. Para. The note on page 211 indicates the words I think you are likely to have used to fill these gaps. These phrases are not fixed cliches like he went as white as a shit, but simply a product of the way each word in an utterance progressively narrows down the range of possibilities for the words which succeed it. Thus, if I say it's a fine ... you can predict that the next word will be day or afternoon, or some such. The sentence could be completed with the words way to calculate the height of a steeple, but it is very unlikely that any given occurrence of the opening, quote, it's a fine ... unquote, would be completed in this way. Now, a common feature of poetry is to break habitual collocation patterns so that words not usually seen together suddenly occur. Poets divorce words from their usual partners and provide unlikely new partnerships between words which we would never have imagined getting together. Thus, Carter shows how Auden, at one point in the poem, avoids an expected collocation like saying that people are, quote, waiting patiently, unquote, and instead says of the idle rich in big cities that they are, quote, waiting expensively for miracles to happen, unquote. Auden also mentions a part of the city in which political exiles live and where they meet to plan their eventual return to power in their own countries as a malicious village. A more usual collocation for village would combine it with approving adjectives to give phrases like friendly village or picturesque village or sleepy village. Carter's overall point is that collocational breaks of this kind signal parts of the poem which are thematically charged and will hence repay further investigation. Para. A final kind of linguistic data used by the stylistician concerns cohesion, C-O-H-E-S-I-O-N. Cohesion is about lexical items, words, which cross the boundaries between sentences, binding them into a single continuous utterance, even though they are grammatically separate sentences. Without cohesion, a text has the awkward start-stop quality of a child's old-fashioned early reader like this. Indent. This is Mandy. Mandy is my friend. Mandy and I go to the pictures together. Indent closes. Page 211. The top start quality can be removed and cohesion achieved by what linguistics call pronominalization, Pronominalization, using pronouns. Thus, indent. This is Mandy, she is my friend, we go to the pictures together. Indent closes. Notice that although these are still grammatically separate sentences, they now flow as a single connected utterance, since the pronouns she and we refer back to people already named. Modern writers have been interested in the effects of distorting patterns of cohesion, and an awareness of this concept helps to appreciate what is going on in something like the following, which is the start of a short story by the American writer Donald Barthelme, Barthelme. Indent. Edward looked at his red beard in the table knife, Stoff. Then Edward and Pia, P-I-A, not he and Pia, went to Sweden, to the farm. In the mailbox, Pia found a check for Willie from the government of Sweden. It was for 2,300 crowns and had a rained-on look. Pia, not she, put the check in the pocket of her brown coat. Pia, not she, was pregnant. In London, she had been sick every day. Indent closes. There are many other linguistic effects here apart from the distortions in the expected cohesion pattern, which I have indicated. Partly the effect comes from the sense of incongruity which arises when a grammatically continuous discourse frames content which is logically, conceptually and emotionally distorted and fragmented. Also, the simple language and short sentences give the tone of a child's reader. Again, but the subject matter is very incongruous with this tone, being particularly adult and traumatic. Through a particular way of using language, then, a certain literary effect is created, and in this circumstance we can legitimately use linguistic techniques in our exploration. Section note. I have used these same examples several times with classes to demonstrate the principle of collocation. The phrases have to be completed without conferring and without prolonged deliberation. Most people write, quote, a box of chocolates, unquote, or, quote, a box of matches, unquote. A few write, quote, a box of hankies, unquote, or, quote, a box of tricks, unquote. These four usually account for all the choices made by a group of 20. A black is usually completed by cat or box. and uninvited is always completed by guest. Page 212. It is an absolute certainty that these phrases will never be completed in anything like 20 different ways by 20 different people. Section Selected Reading. Birch, B-I-R-C-H, David. Language, Literature and Critical Practice. Ways of Analyzing Text. Routledge, 1989. Bradford, Richard. Stylistics. Routledge New Critical Idiom Series, 1997. A very useful and up-to-date account. Butler, Lance, St. John. Registering the Difference. Reading Literature Through Register. Manchester University Press, 1999. A lively and user-friendly linguistics-based approach to literature from slightly outside the mainstream. Carter Ronald ed. Language and Literature, an Introductory Reader in Stylistics. Allen and Unwin, 1982. Chapter 5 is on Hemingway's Cat in the Rain. Carter Ronald and Simpson Paul edited Language, Discourse and Literature, an Introductory Reader in Discourse Stylistics, Routledge, 1988. Carter, Ronald and Barton Deirdre, D-E-I-R-D-R-E, edited Literary Text and Language Study, Edward Arnold, 1982. Chapter 2, Responses to Language in Poetry. Chapman Raymond, Linguistics and Literature, an Introduction to Literary Stylistics, Edward Arnold, 1974. Basic and Short. Cluy Sinner, C-L-U-Y-S-E-N-A-A-R. Annie, an Introduction to Literary Stylistics, Batsford, 1976. Thorough and Basic. Fab, F-A-B-B, Nigel et al. Edited The Linguistics of Writing, Arguments Between Language and Literature, Manchester University Press, 1987. Useful material, see especially the introduction and the chapters by Marie-Louise Pratt, Maurice Hall, and Henry Widdowson. Fish Stanley, Is There a Text in This Class? Harvard University Press, 1980. See chapters 2 and 10, the two parts of the famous essay called What is Stylistics and Why Are They Saying Such Terrible Things About It? Fowler Roger, Linguistic Criticism, Oxford Paperbacks, New Edition, 1996. A Good General Introduction. Macrae, M.C.R.A.E. John, The Language of Poetry, Routledge, 1998. A brief and very helpful book in the Intertext series. Page 213. Tambling Jeremy, What is Literary Language? Open University Press, 1988. Has a useful appendix on critical and rhetorical terms. Toolun, T-O-O-L-N, Michael, Language and Literature, Arnold, 1998. A very useful introduction and workbook in stylistics. Toolun, Michael E.D., Language, Text and Context, Essays in Stylistics, Routledge, 1992. An interesting collection representative of recent trends in stylistics, particularly the strong emphasis on context. For an essay which questions the adequacy of this contextualizing, see Sarah Mill's chapter, Knowing Your Place, a Marxist Feminist Stylistic Analysis. Toolun, Michael, Narrative, A Critical Linguistic Introduction, Routledge. Second edition, 2001, covers literary and non-literary texts, including film, internet, and TV. Widdowson, H.G. Stylistics and the Teaching of Literature, Longman, 1975. A Brief and Simple Guide, page 214, chapter 12, Narratology.